Rishika Fernandopulle is co-founder and CEO of Iora Health. He has an undergraduate and medical degrees from Harvard and received his clinical training at Mass General Hospital. Perhaps more than anything, he is passionate about changing the way healthcare is delivered. Dr. Fernandopulle, thank you so much for joining our Isenberg class.
You're very welcome.
So let me begin with some of the early decisions that you had to make when launching the company. You purposely spread out geography and sponsor type in order to prove your model. Did you do that with a view toward potential customers or investors?
So mainly customers. What we were trying to do is build a new model of healthcare delivery that we thought was scalable across the country. I think a lot of people were trying to change healthcare, but puts around at small scale. We said, if we want to do this, if we want to transform healthcare, we have to do it at scale, which means in multiple geographies. And so if you want to learn to scale, the idea was let's learn to scale. So our first two practices were in Hanover, New Hampshire, and Las Vegas, Nevada. In some ways, that's crazy. Couldn't get two more different places, two more places that are hard to get to from each other, but it's exactly what we wanted to do. So that's really why we decided to do it. Also the startup, I think the whole point of a startup is you're doing something new that no one knows the right thing to do. So your job is to make some very well thought out experiments and try things and rapidly figure out if they're working or not and cut the things that are not working and continue the things that are.
So did your prospective investors question the capital efficiency of that approach?
No, I mean, I think when people did, the simple answer was, this is risk capital. There's a reason it's called that. We are going for a potentially very big outcome, right? Healthcare is $3.5 trillion in the economy. We all know that about a third of what we're doing is waste. There's $1 trillion with a T dollar opportunity here. Almost an infinite market. And so we ought to be willing to put the time and the resources in to figure this out, because if we do, the potential return could be big. And we were looking for investors who had that perspective and not the sort of small ball sort of thing.
So it's clear from the case study that you're passionate about changing the way that healthcare is delivered. It's also clear you have some very, very patient investors. Where and when does the rubber hit the road?
So I think you need to continually show progress, right? And I think, again, we're 5 years into it right now, right? So our first investors put money in, actually they put money in about 4 years, a little more than 4 years ago. And there's almost no chance of them getting any money back for the next several years. But that's fine. What I keep reminding people is we are solving a huge, huge problem. And the core that we're trying to do is we're going to change it on the basis of changing relationships. And that just takes a while. And we're going to figure it out. And while the problem is, while we're building our business, the bogey keeps changing. The healthcare system keeps changing in front of us with the ACA and exchanges and, et cetera. So in some ways, I think that's our big advantage, is we can be much more nimble than the big guys out there. But it's just going to take time until we sort of get that sort of product market fit, because both things are changing. And we just need to find people who are patient, right? I think part of the key is find the right investors. It's not about, I think, best valuation or anything. It's about who's the right fit, who gets what you're trying to do, who's going to be with you for the ride.
And did you look for investors who you thought would be patient?
Oh, absolutely.
And how did you assess that? How did you size that up?
I mean, part of it is asking them. Part of them is looking at their track record of other investments, talking to other sort of CEOs who they've worked with. But again,
and did you in your due diligence, did you talk to other CEOs?
Absolutely. Yeah. Both stuff people they sent me to and people they didn't send me to. Mm-hmm. Right. And I think I found that a lot of people are very happy to sort of give feedback, and we got bad feedback from people that, I would not work with these guys again. And that's great. And these are all phone calls. They're not emails. They're off the record. But I think lots of CEOs were happy to talk to other CEOs about sort of what they felt. But again, I think that the key is, so we just closed the C round. I think I talked to 78 different potential investors. We ended up closing with 4 of them. But it takes a lot of pounding the pavement.
No kidding. Yes. So one of the things that we've talked about is the relationship between the CEO and the board. How would you describe your relationship? What's the interaction? Are they, are you talking to them frequently? And just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, so the other thing that I have a partner, Chris McCown, who's our executive chairman, and I'm a first-time entrepreneur. I'm a doc who decided to change healthcare I'd never done this before. Chris is someone who had taken a company from starting it all the way to selling it for $780 million. And so I think having him on the team made the investors much more confident that they don't need to be hands-on. So we meet with our board once every 3 months, once a quarter. I send them probably email updates once every 6 weeks, maybe once in between those. They have been great at being available when I pick up the phone and call for mundane to sort of complicated questions. Occasionally they'll call me because they have some LP meeting and they need to get an update. But in general, I think there are two types of companies. There are ones where the board is trying to run the company, and another one where the board trusts the CEO to run the company. And you really want to be in the latter situation. I think when the board tries to run the company, bad things happen.
So another thing we've talked about is splitting the equity pie. And you mentioned Chris, and I also know that your other founders are Xander Packard and Neil Patel, all very accomplished in their respective fields. How did you go about dividing the equity pie?
Yeah, I mean, I think you need to be sort of big boys and girls and actually explicitly talk about it and talk about who's starting the company, who's bringing what to the table, and how are you going to.
And so, how did you do it? Did you I don't know, create spreadsheets and I'm responsible for this and you're responsible for that? Did you? Give us as much detail as you're willing to share.
Yeah, I mean, so really the way it worked for us is Chris and I sort of started the company, and Neil and Xander were brought on later. So they got more sort of shares out of the option pool, which is sort of distributed sort of differently than Chris and I.
And there were tax issues if they came in later and there's already some value.
Yeah. Exactly. So but when Chris and I talked about doing the company, we sort of just figured out who's bringing what to the table, and let's divide it fairly. In some ways, I think it sort of doesn't matter, right? I think one of the things I learned is I think a lot of people early on starting companies spend too much time arguing over little bits of percentages. In some ways, the default value of all of these new enterprises is zero. And that the more you can do to increase your probability that you're not going to be zero, that's what you should do. But
also, I think people do care about their relative stakes. That is important. Isn't that fair to say?
I think it is. And getting that relative amount right is important. But in general, whether you get 15 or 20% in the big picture doesn't really matter.
Yeah. All right, so let's talk about scaling. And that's really one of the interesting stories with Iora. And in a lot of ways, you're a people business, you're a service business. Yes. And oftentimes scaling people businesses is a challenge, particularly because you got to maintain quality and you got to maintain that corporate culture. I'm sure you've thought about that a lot.
We think about it all the time, and we're harder because we're actually scaling it in multiple cities. So at the moment, by the end of this year, we're going to be at 30 practices in 11 different cities. So, and we've done that quickly, right? So I think when the case ended, we had maybe 4 practices, and then the beginning of this year, we had 12. We're at 30 by the end of this year. So we are hiring lots and lots of people in lots and lots of places. It is all about culture.
And so how do you actually, what's the blocking and tackling? How do you go about doing it?
Yeah, so the first thing is being really explicit about building a company culture, right? This is all about scaling culture. Too many people spend too much time thinking about the process and the technology and the payment model. Yes, but if you don't get the culture right, all that doesn't matter. It means, making sure you get the right people on the bus. I think the most important thing is hiring the right people, and especially the first people.
And what are some of your favorite questions to ask when hiring?
Yeah, so I think really, why are you doing this? What makes you wake up in the morning? I think that's really good. I think asking people about sort of successes and failures they've had and how they've dealt with it is really important. I think one of the things about being in a startup is things will not go right, always. And what you almost want, anyone when things go right can perform well. You want people who can perform well when things go poorly, not start blaming people. And
so do you look for people who maybe had a few battle scars along the way?
Absolutely. I think it's really, really important to do that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I also know that one of the tensions identified in the case was the build it yourself versus license technology, and with all of the many large and small companies with software in the healthcare space, I suspect that you had some pressure from some corners to go out and license it, saying, you're not in the software business, you're in the healthcare business. How did you manage that conversation?
Absolutely. So many early investors, including one or two that actually ended up investing, I think had said, you cannot be good at both being a services company and a software company. Those are two different things. Why don't you just go buy a system? And I think my answer is it would be great if that were true. I would like nothing better than that were true. But the problem is we're doing a fundamentally different business than almost any other practice. And so not surprisingly, the software out there is written for the other folks, right? They're written for helping people document, code, and build higher, not at all to take a population of people, improve their health, and keep them out of trouble. And so the two big reasons: A, it didn't exist, and the other reason is I needed to tweak it, right? So we are evolving this system, right? The thing I think we're doing, as a good startup should, is continually evolving the model. I needed to be able to evolve the technology as rapidly as I evolved my service business. So if I changed the way I want to practice, the technology had to go with me. Good luck getting Epic or one of these big companies to evolve that quickly.
And is the assumption, though, that if you're going to invest in technology, you better scale and grow fast in order to justify that expense?
So you do. So one of the things that why we have 30 practices right now, right? So trying to spread this fixed cost out. And I think one thing we realized is so practicing medicine in 2015 requires a certain platform, right? You can't just be a doc hanging out a shingle with your wife as a billing manager, and we're managing populations. This is a sophisticated data-related task. We need sophisticated systems. We have to build it. We have to spread that cost over big enough, and so that's why we have to grow. So again, you have to, and not too fast, but not too slow either.
So one of the things I thought that was interesting in the case is it talked about the sales process. And I think we know that oftentimes health plan decisions are made in the Human Resources Office. But you made it a point of getting into the CEO's office because of the fundamental difference that your plan offered. Was that a challenge to get beyond the Human Resource Department and into the C-suite?
So we have been lucky enough to have enough sort of a high profile. So we started with this practice in Atlantic City as a pilot and being written up in the New Yorker, an article with Atul Gawande. So lots and lots of people read that. We have not done any outbound calling, actually. So all of our clients have been from inbound activity. We don't have a sales force.
You are different.
Yes, we don't have a sales force. So these are people calling us. And there's a reason for it. It's really a waste of our time for us to go to people. Everett Rogers had this great curve about diffusion of innovation, where innovation doesn't diffuse randomly. You start with people who are the real innovators, that they just wake up in the morning, the guys who line up for the iPhones the first day they come out, and then the early adopters, and then the later adopters, and the laggards. So you need to not waste your time with the people who are going to be laggards or even late adopters. You only should spend your time on the people who are truly innovators. So our first sponsor, Jim Kim, CEO, who is president of Dartmouth College. Jim is a Harvard MD, PhD, a MacArthur Genius Award winner, ran the World Bank before he was 50, right? Not a normal guy. Tony Hsieh, CEO of Zappos, billionaire before he's 40, not a normal guy. Sarah Horowitz from the Freelancers Union, one of our things. She's a MacArthur Genius Award winner on the board of New York Fed before she's 45. Not a normal person, right? So we need not only... So putzing around when you have a new idea with the HR director is a waste of time. We had to go to not just the CEO, but visionary CEOs who can get that we're trying to do something different and we're willing to go with it.
So I note that Bill Salmon, one of the authors of our case study, is a small investor in your company. I suspect he provided you with some words of advice along the way. What were they?
Yeah, so he's provided a bunch of advice. So a couple of things. So one really is to sort of stick with your principles and be willing to try and build a built company. I think a lot of people, I think in a well-meaning way, try and tell you to sort of go sideways and do something that might be easier, right? So the thing we get all the time is that what you're doing is too hard. Why don't you do something simpler, like build a disease management program for asthma? And while tempting, I think the answer is no. This is what we're doing. And yes, it's hard, but we think, and we expect there to be a bigger return if we can get it right. Mm-hmm. So I think having people like Bill tell us stick with that is really helpful.
So last question. We have a number of would-be entrepreneurs at the Isenberg School who are watching this. And as a first-time CEO, what kind of words of wisdom might you share with them as they think about their careers and perhaps being entrepreneurs themselves?
So I guess a couple. So one is, this is really hard. I think a lot of, I have a nephew who's graduated from college and wants to be an entrepreneur. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of young folks see the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world and and they think this is easy and this happened quickly. And it didn't. It didn't for Zuckerberg, didn't for me, almost doesn't for anyone. Sure, you might get lucky, but you might win the lottery too, right? So you should only do this if you're willing to get on the long road. This has been 11 years since I started doing this.
And
right?
What has surprised you the most along the way?
Yeah, so one is just how you just have to keep changing, right? So you start with an idea. It is almost never the idea you start with that will turn into something. We started doing sort of retail practices, a thing called direct primary care. We morphed into sort of working at the consulting company. This is probably a third big sort of change. And that's fine. That's exactly how it works. And you'll never figure out the right idea if you don't try a few wrong ideas. But you have to be willing to sort of take a ride. You have to be willing to enjoy the journey. I think if you're purely focused on the end, it's not worth it. Right?
Well, the journey with you in this conversation has been a delight. So thank you so much. And I know my students appreciate it as well.
Great.
So thank you,
You're very
Dr.
welcome.
Fernandopulle.